Well, earlier this summer, Jessica and I were blessed to be able to take our first ever vacation with our little 1-year-old daughter, Naomi, and we went up to Erie, Pennsylvania, which is also the first time we'd ever been there. Has anyone here been to Erie? Yeah. So we had really good weather, and we're blessed to have a great few days there, and it was just really perfect weather and perfect scenery. And there's one thing I saw on that vacation that really stayed with me, though. It was the afternoon we went over, and we were on Presque Isle, which is a beautiful place, and we went to the Perry Monument, which is one of the more scenic places on the island. And that day there was a large crowd of people gathered around the monument, as you would expect. What was interesting is that almost all of those people gathered there, they weren't looking at the scenery, they weren't looking at each other. Instead, they had their faces glued down to the screens on their phones. And then out of the phone, you could hear some music, and it was the music of Pokemon Go, which was really the kind of like hottest video game of the summer. So those people weren't there to, enjoy the views, enjoy Perry Monument. They were there to hunt Pokemon. And I actually learned after vacation that the crowds of people who are gathered there, not looking where they're going and all that, it's gotten so bad that the owners of the island are petitioning the makers of Pokemon to take the Perry Monument off the list of the Pokestops, which if you're not a Pokemon aficionado, is where Pokemon players go to gather supplies. It's gotten to be, there's so many people gathered there, playing at this time. And so now I thought, well, it was interesting to see that. Now, I don't want to put down Pokemon Go players. Actually, my wife was playing it for a time, so I'd get in trouble if I did that. But I did think that there is a problem when you have this image. You're on, one of the most scenic places, scenic places certainly in Pennsylvania. You have people who are there at these beaches, but they're not looking at the creation God made. They're not looking even at one another, other people who are made in the image and likeness of God. Instead, their eyes are fixed on a screen. It's an interesting image. And so it made me think of the fact that, in one sense, in the age of the internet, we're more connected than ever before, but maybe in another deeper sense, we are more distant from one another than ever before. And I think that, if the only way you see your fellow human beings is through a screen, whether that's your phone, whether that's a computer, whether even that's just watching people on TV news evening after evening, that in itself can be distancing. It can be dehumanizing. And that's one reason people wonder, in this age of social media, has that really turned into anti-social media, in the sense that people aren't comfortable having face-to-face conversations anymore, really building those relationships, flesh and blood relationships that we really need, that we really long for as human beings made in the image of God. In fact, when I turn to our parable from the Gospel of Luke today, the story of the rich man and Lazarus, one thing I wondered is, maybe he wasn't so much a wicked man as he was a distracted man. And so maybe he was into whatever his own society's equivalent of Pokemon Go was, whatever kept people distracted, always on the go. And I make that connection. I think it's important because it's tempting for us when we read this story to say, oh, this rich man is so different than us. He must have been especially cruel, especially wicked. But there's actually no evidence for that in the gospel. Luke, the gospel writer here, he doesn't actually tell us that this rich man was especially bad, that he enjoyed kicking homeless people when they're down, that he liked to make poor people work on holidays like Ebenezer Scrooge or somebody like that. Actually, he may even have been more tolerant than rich people today, because he at least allows Lazarus the beggar to sit outside his gates. You can imagine a rich person today calling the cops on the person, making him move, go beg somewhere else. And he doesn't do that in this story. But instead, this rich man, he ends up separated from God, not for something he did, but for something he didn't do. That's what separates him. So the rich man's crime is that he fails to notice Lazarus. Or if he does notice the poor man begging outside his gates, he just accepts it as a part of the scenery. He takes it for granted. I'm in my place. I can enjoy my fine linens, my rich food in my house. And of course, this man should be out here begging on the streets. It doesn't grieve him in his heart that Lazarus should be wallowing outside his gates in pain and hunger, while inside he is enjoying a life of a carefree life of wealth. And so the rich man fails to notice a human being who is made in the image of God. He fails to notice him suffering, and for that, he ends up with a great chasm. That's the term in the Scripture. A great chasm fixed between himself and Lazarus. And even worse, the great chasm separates the rich man from God for all eternity. And of course, it's here that this parable becomes one of the most convicting parables in all of Scripture for me. So it makes me almost want to pretend that it's not there. Because how many times have I, walked down the street? If you walk down to go to a Pirates game, if you go to a movie or a show, and you pass somebody who's begging for food, and you just walk by and you don't give them the time of day, how many times have we all done that? I just take it for granted in those situations. I should be where I am, enjoying my family, and they should be where they are, just laying there on the street asking for help. But of course, we're good at coming up with excuses for why we shouldn't help. We tell ourselves, well, if I actually was to give them a few dollars, they would just spend it on alcohol or drugs. And so we reassure ourselves it's okay to pass them by. And, there may be perfectly logical reasons for not giving cash to somebody who is dealing with an addiction. But honestly, this parable of the rich man and Lazarus is not the place to look for those reasons. Because what I mean is that we don't have, just as we don't have a reason to think that the rich man was especially bad or especially cruel, we also don't have a reason to think that the beggar Lazarus was an especially good man. For all we know, he may have been a scoundrel. He may have been an addict there on the streets. But for Jesus, that's not what is relevant here. You got to remember, this is in the Gospel of Luke, the same gospel where Jesus tells a violent criminal on the cross next to him that he will be the first man to ever enter paradise. That in itself should tell us that Jesus judges people a bit differently than we tend to do. And so for Jesus, the rich man should have helped Lazarus, not for any good thing that he had done to deserve it. Instead, it's the image of God in Lazarus that demands the rich man give up his resources, give up his time to help him. And of course, as a Jew, the rich man certainly should have known that was his obligation. It says that over and over again in the Scriptures. One of the clearest places is in Deuteronomy 15, where God tells the people of Israel, do not be hard-hearted and never be tight-fisted toward your needy neighbor. You should rather open your hand widely until you meet their need, whatever it may be. And again, God does not specify there that you're only supposed to help if you're sure that they're not a drunkard or an addict or anything like that. God just expects that His people are going to give generously, just as our Father in heaven does. Just as our Father in heaven makes the rain to fall on both the wicked and the good. Of course, in our society, we're taught to be suspicious of one another from the time we're young, so that's difficult to treat one another that way. There's a chasm that's fixed between us and the people around us that's every bit as big as that chasm that separated the rich man from Lazarus. And that's why I've always liked a story about C.S. Lewis, who's one of my favorite Christian writers. But there's a story about Lewis. He was walking down the street with a close friend one day, and they were talking, and they passed a man who was living on the streets, and he was asking for help, begging for change. And Lewis's friend just did what all of us have done many times. He fixed his eyes straight ahead and kept on walking past the beggar, kept going. But Lewis turned around and he actually emptied his wallet and gave him every bit of cash that he happened to have on him that day. And then when Lewis caught up with his friend turned to him and said, "What in the world are you doing, giving him your money like that? Don't you know that he's just going to squander all of that on ale?" And at that, Lewis paused for a moment and then replied, "Well, that's all I was going to do with it anyways." And I like that story because, Lewis there is when it comes down to it, he's recognizing that guy on the street is probably not so much different than he is after all. He may look different, he may smell a bit different, but deep down, they each have their own struggles. They each have their own flaws. They each have their things they might waste money on from time to time. Some of it might be worse than others. What C.S. Lewis in that story does is what the rich man does not do. He takes a moment to empathize with the person he sees and to put himself in his perspective, to see things from his perspective. You know, there's that line in the book, the classic book To Kill a Mockingbird, which talks about putting yourself in somebody else's shoes and walking around in them for a while. You know, that's what Lewis does in that story. That's exactly what the rich man should have been doing for that beggar outside of his gates named Lazarus. And I think that's a skill we as Christians had better learn. That skill of empathizing with others, putting ourselves in their shoes, being willing to feel somebody else's suffering in our own hearts. That's a valuable skill for a believer because we believe that in Jesus, that's exactly what God did for us. He put himself in our shoes. He saw things from our perspective. And again, it's easy when you read a parable like the rich man and Lazarus to just get overwhelmed, to think, oh gosh, what am I supposed to do? And when I look at the problems in the world, there's too much going on to even know where to begin, to even know where to start. So we want to put our blinders on and just keep going like the rich man and pretend the problems aren't there. Just focus on our own distractions, and we invite things into our lives. It might not be Pokemon Go, but we invite distractions and entertainment in our lives to blind us to what's really going on around us. But if that's the case for you, I'd invite you to do something that sounds a bit counterintuitive, which I would invite us today to ask God to work in our hearts and to give us a healthy sense of grief. And I said the word grief as in sadness, which is not something you've probably ever asked God for, but I think there's a reason to, so bear with me for a moment, because Ricardo read today a passage from the prophet Amos, who lived, in the Old Testament times. And we see Amos in this passage. He is absolutely blasting the rich, putting them down in the strongest possible terms. He criticizes them for lying on beds of ivory, eating rich foods, singing fancy songs, drinking wine from bowls. But the issue for Amos is not that the rich are rich. It's that they're enjoying all these things while at the same time not being grieved for the ruin of Joseph. Now, Joseph here is a term for the whole people of Israel. So in other words, Amos is saying that while the rich are enjoying themselves, the majority of their countrymen's lives are falling apart, and they just don't care. It doesn't grieve them deep down in their souls, because if they were grieved by what their fellow human beings are going through, then they would act and they would do something about it. They wouldn't ignore it like the rich man ignores Lazarus, but instead they would get down off their perch, they would get down in the trenches, and they would work to relieve the suffering of their fellow countrymen, their fellow human beings. So you see, the reason that grief at what the people around you are going through can be a healthy thing is that it can lead us towards doing something about the problem. So for example, if it grieves you that there are families and kids around who are going without food, then maybe God put that grief on your heart so that you could act. Maybe it means you're called to start a new feeding program, or at least support an organization that is working to feed those who are most in need. Kelly Stasek, from talking to her, she has that grief on her heart, which is why she's been sharing the videos and all that about doing a little free pantry at the church. Gus, God has put a grief in his heart for those who are addicted. So Gus is working. God gave him that grief for a reason. It's not just so he can sit around and be sad all the time. It's so he can do something about it. I personally, it grieves me when I see the lonely lives that so many people are living, especially people who are shut in around our partnership and who are sick. And I want to make sure they're getting visited on a regular basis, not just by me, but by other folks in our church, which is why you can read about the partnership care team that I'm inviting people to be a part of and doing a training for later in October. So we can be better at making sure the people in each of our churches and our partnership are being visited regularly and being cared for. So ask yourself today, what grieves you? Who are the people? What are the needs that your heart breaks for? Does it grieve you that so many people around us lack hope? And in that lack of hope, that despair, they do turn to drugs or alcohol to meet their needs. Does it grieve you? We live in a society where a pharmaceutical company can jack up the prices of EpiPens of all things beyond what most people who need them can actually afford. Does that grieve you in your heart? Have you let yourself grieve at that? Just this last week, were you grieved when you saw what's going on in our country, when you saw more unarmed black men get shot by police? And were you grieved at those riots in Charlotte, which are getting so out of hand? Are you grieved by that? Are you grieved by the suffering on both sides? And have you taken that to God? Do you not just pass it by? Are you grieved so that you want to do something there? And of course, when I saw what's going on in the country this past week, I thought we in the church have a lot of work to do. Because of all people, of all places, we should be those who are totally open to the folks around us, those who look different than us, those who think differently than us, those from a different background than us. Because if we're not the place where people around us can find reconciliation with God and with one another, our fellow human beings made in His image, then what on earth are we here for? We have to ask ourselves these questions. We can't be like the rich man and put our blinders on. God calls us to grieve about what's going on and then to do something about it. But we do so knowing that in God's eyes, all of us were once the beggar Lazarus on the side of the road longing for help. Only we weren't covered in sores like Lazarus was. No, we were covered in our sins, our own disobedience to our God who made us. But that's when God's Son, the one who was perfectly rich, the one who had all things, saw our need and looked at us with grief. It grieved Him when He saw His children suffering, when He saw His children wandering far from God, wandering into that far country. And so in His grief, He left His gates behind and He came down among us. He put on our shoes and walked around in them, saw the world from our perspective. But even more, seeing our need, He gave everything up to help us. He is the one who, though He was in the form of God, yet He did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. But He emptied Himself, taking on our human likeness, taking the form of a slave. And thanks be to God, He emptied Himself and found in human form, became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. He who was rich, yet for our sakes became poor, so that by His poverty we might become rich. And His triumph over death, His rising from the grave, He has thrown the gates to His mansion wide open, and He invites us in to sit with Him and to eat. And so, friends, Jesus is the one who bridged the greatest divide possible. He bridged that divide separating us from God, and He did so with the blood of His cross, freely given for you and me and for the life of the world. And His blood is still strong enough today to overcome whatever chasms, whatever distances, divides separate us from one another and from the love of God.